Okay, hello everyone. We'll get started. I think most people have been able to log in successfully. So welcome to our webinar series during this COVID-19 period. We are offering these webinars weekly on topics which are selected to help build awareness on different improvement methodologies and tools that we have used in the past. Today's topic is on prioritizing resources during slowdown and ramp up. And these are conditions that we find ourselves presently during these COVID times. It is being presented by Asim Khan. Asim is a founding member and senior partner at Analyze and Improve. He has over 15 years of experience in the mining and petroleum industry. He has led many projects in operational excellence, different initiatives, as well as technical projects, specializing in process improvement, constraint modeling, and performance management. He has a PhD in mine operations research and is a Lean Six Sigma Black Belt. So on today's topic, he has successfully coached many operations and businesses globally on the best use of resources according to their system constraints and bottlenecks. So before I hand this over to Asim, a little bit on the structure of our talk. We will start with a pre-recorded video presentation on the topic. And while the presentation is running, you can ask any questions that you may have in the questions tab. You see it on the right-hand side of your screen. And we will keep an eye on these questions during the presentation and answer them at the end of the presentation. We will also have an opportunity to talk face-to-face and discuss any further questions or interesting points through a Google Meet session after the webinar. So a link has been added into the chat window, which you can see right now, which you can attend. And I will also repeat that link at the very end so that you have it in case you want to join us at the end. So without further ado, let me hand this back to Asim.
Thanks, Carmen. So before I load the video that Carmen was talking about, just a little bit on topic of theory of constraints. Some of you may have read this book, The Goal. I'm going to refer to that book and that theory. It's a good novel. If you get a chance, grab this book and read it. It's written as a business novel, and it talks really about the concepts that we're going to be discussing today. So let me load that video, and after that, we'll get to your questions. Hi, welcome to another ANI Learning webinar series. Today's topic is prioritizing resources during COVID-19 slowdown and wrap up. Obviously, it's a unique situation. However, any slowdown wrap up, such as strikes or other times, could also be applicable. So let me set the context first. COVID-19 has impacted millions of people, and in turn, businesses and global economy. Most of the businesses have been impacted either through shortage of people or mandatory closure of businesses. Obviously, this has resulted in either slowdown of operations or, in some cases, complete shutdowns. Today's talk is going to look into both scenarios and present an approach to maximize returns from constrained resources. The approach is based on application of theory of constraint. So a bit on agenda. Obviously, I will get into what theory of constraints are, a bit on bottlenecks and constraints, as they will be applicable here. And then we'll look actually at three different scenarios, few for slowing down and few for ramping up, based on that theory of constraint and bottleneck and constraints, and see how we can prioritize the resources and maximize returns. Finally, I would conclude with do's and don'ts of this approach. So theory of constraints. Underlying assumption here is that if you're trying to maximize the system throughput, if that's your goal, it is going to be limited by at least one constraint. If you don't have a constraint, then you can have infinite throughput. Basically, as simple as that. The quote comes from a book by Goldratt and Cox, where this theory of constraint kind of got formalized. The book was called The Goal, A Process of Ongoing Improvement, and the quote is, "Only by increasing flow through the constraint can overall throughput be increased." So once we've got that assumption in place, it's always good to focus on the bottleneck and any other constraint you have in the system. The 5 steps, which are outlined in that book, are identify the system constraints. As it says, constraints here. They don't talk about bottleneck, but basically your primary constraint is your bottleneck, and your secondary, tertiary, or how many other constraints you may have in the system are called secondary constraints. Decide how to exploit the system's constraints. So again, the idea here is, how can I get more out of existing resources for that constraint or bottleneck? Subordinate everything else to above decisions. So once you decided to exploit the system constraint, everything else have to enable that exploitation. So what does that mean? It means that if there's any other processes, people, policies which are impacting, slowing down the constraint, we need to remove, get rid of, or change those policies, and then get the resources of non-constrained processes to the constraint process. Next step is to alleviate the system constraint. So this obviously applies if your constraint that you're exploiting and you're subordinating to is still a constraint in the system. Then you have to now looking at the capability, interaction of different processes to get more out of the system, or look at the capital solutions at that point. The 5th step, which is also a warning, is if in the previous steps the constraint has been broken. By broken constraint means that it's no longer the bottleneck. The bottleneck has moved from your primary constraint to something else. At that point, go back to step 1, but do not follow inertia to cause a system constraint. Excuse me. So what does that mean? Is when you're improving the constraint, at some point it may become a non-constraint, or your bottleneck may move. And if you keep now building more capacity in that constraint, you're actually going to cause more issues. The non-constrained process will now, resources being spent there won't be optimal. And somewhere else you will have a system constraint stopping things down. A little bit more on bottlenecks and constraints. So I'm gonna give you an example of an integrated mining process. So this is an example of mining, milling, smelting, refining operation, and those are the main processes underneath each one of them, those facilities. Then for me to understand where my bottleneck and constraints are, I need to remove the external variation of each process and look at only the internal variation inherent within each process. Once I can get that picture, like I have it here in the yellow bars, then I know where's my bottleneck. In this case, the grinding. That's the one which is going to stop me the most. But more importantly, where are my other secondary constraints? These are good to know, because once you start exploiting or alleviating the bottleneck, these will become the next bottlenecks and the problems. So that being said, let's get into the scenarios. Excuse me. And to get into scenarios, I'm going to start with a process flow sheet case study. So in this case, I've kept it simple. This used to be actual operation. I've converted it into generic names. So process A to process I. Process A and B are in parallel, feeding process C through a stockpile. And then process C feeds process A, H through a parallel circuit of 2 processes in series. And finally, process I is where your final product is produced. So if this was a given system, and let's say these were the steady state process capabilities of each of the process, so we've got some availabilities of each process, we've got some throughput rate in units per hour, and obviously units per day capability of each process. So if this is my baseline, this is where I'm starting, let's look at scenario 1. This applies to a slowdown condition. And let's say you've got constrained maintenance resources. So approach 1 is loss of maintenance across all processes. So because you have less maintenance resources, you're going to, in this scenario, take that cut across all processes and maintain them less equally. So I simulated a 30% loss of availability across all processes to represent the short maintenance resource. This could be mechanics, shop, material, whatever. Total production out of the facility operation for this scenario was 2,259 units per day. It's not good bad at this point, but the question you need to ask is this the best use of the constrained maintenance resource? So the other way to do this is the approach two, is to say, okay, I'm actually going to take that loss across non-constrained processes, and I'm going to keep maintaining my constrained processes as is. So to do that, I need to understand where my constraints are. So here I have given you a snapshot of where the constraints were when the process is running steady state. As you can see, here your process G is the bottleneck or the primary constraints, and DEI are your other constraints, secondary constraints, which could become problems. And the table basically gives you a rank of each process and where they are. So once I have this information, now I can go back to my approach two, which is loss of maintenance across the non-constrained process. So to simulate it, I took no availability loss at the constrained process, rank 1 to 4. So my top four constraints, I simulated no availability loss. But then I took the overall 30% equivalent loss at all the other non-constrained processes. So basically what that means is my maintenance resource is still down throughout the system 30%. I've just taken a bigger loss at the non-constrained processes. Total production out of this facility operation for this scenario increases to 5,531 units. That's about 145% improvement on the previous scenario, which was cutting availability across all processes. So, so in this case, obviously, taking the tier constraint approach and understanding, keeping your bottlenecking constraints running, maintaining them fully with even with the constrained resources, and then taking your non-constrained processes and maybe reducing your maintenance activities there gives you the best return. Let's look at another one, this one more on production side than availability. So we're going to look at the constrained production resources during slowdown of scenario again. So approach one, similar to availability, let's say loss of production rate across all processes. So assumption here is I've lost my resources by 50%, and I'm going to simulate a 50% loss of throughput capacity this time across all processes to represent the production resource. Total production out of the facility operation through scenario is 5,428 units per day. So that's 50% loss across all processes, results in 5,400 units. Again, is this the best use of constrained production resources? We now look at the other scenario where we look at non-constrained processes and apply more production losses there. So similarly, a simulation of 50% loss of throughput capacity across non-constrained processes to represent the production resource. So what does that mean? I'm keeping my constrained processes fully running. I'm utilizing my resources. I'm taking resources away from non-constrained processes and putting in the constrained resources. And yes, my non-constrained resources are going to be even lower than 50%, but my overall resources throughout the facility remains at 50% loss. Total production increases to 6,131 units per day. Let's say a 13% improvement. Okay, it's not as big as the availability. However, as you can see, focusing on constraints still gets you a higher return. Now let's look at a scenario for ramp-up condition. So in this case, we have constrained resources. Let's say similar to 50% resources is what you can bring up as you're ramping up. Where can we best use them? So approach one, bringing limited processes back up based on constraints, if applicable. If applicable, I mean applicable because in this scenario, what I'm simulating is processes coming online only on path of parallel processes based on a constrained ranking and throughputs. What does that mean? If I was to go back to this flow sheet and you have got a scenario where you've got processes in parallel, like process A and B, process D, E to F and G. Then in this case, you would try to understand where the constraints are and which one gets you the biggest returns, and take the other parallel process off. So let's go back. That's what I did. I simulated a 50% resource throughout the system by keeping by taking one of the parallel legs off in both cases, and then distributing the rest of the last resources to the non-constrained processes. Total production out of the facility gets to 6223 units per day, approximately 50% more production if you would have gone with 3 processes down and with the same amount of resources compared to if you've gone with the 50% resources across all processes. Another approach for the same constrained resources during ramp up is to build temporary stockpiles behind and in front of your bottleneck. It goes back to theory of constraint. You're trying to exploit the system constraint. So really what we're trying to do is a bottleneck. We're trying to make sure it gets fed whenever it's running. And it has the ability to store or leave its process, its product somewhere when it's producing. So it's not going to be starved, and it's not going to be limited by anything else. To do that, the best thing you can do is build temporary stockpiles. So what I did is simulated the stockpile before and after the bottleneck and primary constraint to hold up to 1 week of production. So we're going to do that during the ramp-up stage. Total production output of the facility through this scenario is 6323 units per day. Again, it's approximately 16% more production versus if you'd just gone with the 50% resources applied to every process and no building of stockpiles. Obviously, the next question is, what if I was to combine the 2 approaches? If I had the luxury of having parallel processes and I was able to build temporary storages in the ramp up, what can I get more? So I basically took the first approach and second approach, simulated both processes at the same time. So you've got one of the paths on the parallel processes working, and one is offline. And we've got a stockpile of 1 week of production supporting the bottleneck. In that case, your total production actually goes up to 7266 units per day. That's approximately now 38% more production with processes when compared to 50% resource, same resource applied across all processes without looking at the constraints, non-constraints. Hopefully, these 3 different scenarios and 6, 7 different approaches helps you understand that when you've got a situation where you've got limited resources, the best thing to do is look at the constraints and bottlenecks. Obviously, I started the talk with it being a COVID-19 scenario where you've actually got constrained resources. In steady state, we still have got limited resources. We usually do not have infinite resources. So that theory of constraints still is applicable. If you're trying to maximize the return, you should still always be looking at your bottleneck and constraints. Okay, I'll conclude with this do's and don'ts. If you're using this approach, you must understand where are the bottlenecks and constraints. Do not start with a perceived bottleneck. So what does that mean? One, if you're not sure where your bottleneck is, but you think you know, confirm it. Because I've seen in past where a perceived bottleneck is something when it goes down or when it causes an issue, it causes a major issue across the facility. Everybody has a day off or they're just sitting doing nothing. That's the one people remember. But a process which does not cause as much of an issue, as much of a downtime, but goes down frequently or causes issues frequently, maybe a bigger bottleneck or a bigger constraint or bottleneck. So in that case, you want to confirm where your bottleneck is so you start at the right process. Secondly, you want to know where your other constraints are, because as soon as you start alleviating the bottleneck or exploiting the bottleneck, it will eventually move to the next constraint. So if you didn't know, then you're going to lose some opportunity and time than figuring it out. At some point, bottleneck was shift, as I said, based on changing resources. So you have to re-rank your constraints and adjust accordingly. Do not look at each facility individually. If you have got an integrated multiple facility operation, identify the system constraints. So what does that mean? Like the example I was giving you, if you got a mine, mill, smelter, refinery, and it's integrated, each one kind of depend on each other. In that case, you want to look at bottlenecking constraints throughout the whole integrated facility. Similarly applicable to if you got a manufacturing or office environment, you've got processes which are being constrained by something else. You want to know where that constraint sits and then work on that constraint. Once you have an idea of constraints, it is easy to try simulate any given scenario, understand the realistic return. So the good part or the hard part is to understand where the constraints are. Once you've got that understanding, now you can do a lot of what if analysis and see what the return is before you go start applying those ideas. That marks the end of my presentation. Thank you for attending. Guys, I have a few more slides I wanted to walk through just to clarify some of the scenarios. So just give me a second to share my screen. Yeah, so let me show you some of the numbers which went into those simulations. So for availability scenarios, this was on the slowdown side. When I was talking about 30% loss all across, what that means is I was removing 30% availability. So processor is down 30% of the time more, and it's all across each process. Versus when I'm saying 30% equivalent in non-constraints, I kept the constrained processes, my DE, G, and I, which were the top 4 constraints, I kept them at no losses. So we're making a strategic call here, diverting the availability or mechanic resources, whatever we have, to those processes more, and then not doing as much availability for the time being on the other processes. That's where I went from 2259 to 5531. Similarly, when you look at production rate scenarios, 50% loss all across is about now the throughput rate. So 50% reduction in what it was able to do on per hour, again, based on a distribution. So it's not the same number, it changes, but equivalent product, my 50% loss all across. And when I say we're going to remove or apply more to the non-constraint, but not to the constraints, so this is what it looked like. I still had some loss at the constraints, so about 20%. And then everything else took the rest to make up that 50% loss in the throughput. And that's what increases it from 5428 to 6131. In the ramp-up scenarios, when I say 50% all across, that's the same scenario as in slowdown. So you only have 50% resources when you're coming back up. That's the assumption. You can go all across, or you can look at parallel path and turn that off if it's applicable, right? Like if you have that luxury, you have some processes which are sitting in parallel path and there are some constraints there, then you can maximize that strategy. In this case, this is what it looks like. I took process A, F, and G completely offline, and then took the rest of the 50% resource down across the rest of the flow sheet to get me to 6223. And then I wanted to compare not having this, but just temporary storage bottleneck conversation that the constraint kind of pushes. So I went back to saying, okay, I'm going to still start with 50% loss all across, and then just add the temporary storage. And that's what gets you 6323, even though they look the same almost. There are 2 different scenarios which are being built. And so the last one that I showed you is combining the 2. So you actually went back to turning some of them off, and having a storage in place gives you even more production. So let me shut this off. Okay, so that hopefully gets the point across I was trying to make. I'm going to look through the questions. I see one question is there. It says, what is the impact of cash conversion? on inventory buildup, for example? Yeah, that's a good question. In the world of lean and even in theory of constraints, inventory is not looked at very good, right? It's always you have some capital or cash tied to inventory buildup, or inventory is a waste in lean, for example. But with that understanding, not having enough inventory can also hurt the processes if it's not there at the right time. So in this example, if you need to keep the bottleneck by definition fed and make sure the bottleneck is able to produce everything it can produce, it's not being limited upstream, then it's okay to have that inventory. And going back to the cash conversion conversation, in this scenario, it's about a week of inventory. So usually within the month, you've caught up on that cash which has been invested. I think when I simulated it, my inventory was not filling up more than a week anyways, so it's about a week time, whatever that equivalent cash is. Hopefully I answered that question. Is there any other questions? You guys can ask in the question tab or chat window.
So while we're waiting for people to put the extra comments, do you have any direct experiences in terms of the link between your mathematical models and sort of reality? Are they closely aligned or sort of 50-50, so to speak?
I mean, obviously, as I was alluding to, this model is actually from a facility built. I converted it to get the point across, and I just didn't want to use an example of one industry. But yeah, so usually when you're trying to get those bottlenecks and constraints understanding, you have to go look at the information first. It's not just a Excel or just a simulation model by itself, right? You're not just getting numbers on averages. You need to look at your historical data. You need to look at slowdowns, shutdowns, and understand, what are the real external and internal variations in each of the process, because that will give you a solid picture of your constraints. And once you have that, it's exactly like the real scenario. So you can then be very confident in the return. So whenever I have actually got to that level of model, which you can get there pretty quick once you start looking at the information, they're very realistic returns. So you can, we had a scenario where we're able to take away a big capital investment out of the system because you're able to get more from the existing resources by looking at where to focus. Right.
Thanks.
Okay. Wait a few more minutes. Yep. You talked about the polls.
I will mention it here if you think we're ready to move on. Well, yeah, I can add a few comments and then see if there's any other questions left.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a few poll questions which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, or depending how you're looking at it. But anyway, there's a tab called polls with a couple of questions. And we'd appreciate your feedback, which includes future topics. So anything you can provide with us in terms of feedback would be appreciated. And we are also archiving these webinars on our website. So in case you want to view this one again or a previous one, you can also do that through our website. And I think if we're done with the Q&A part of the session, those of you who wish to further discuss this topic, something a little bit more personal, direct questions, or just a discussion in general, there is a Google link that you can find in the chat window. At the bottom of the chat window, there is a link you can click on, and we will be there to field any of your comments and questions. I think we're done. So on behalf of both of us, I'd like to thank everyone for having attended this webinar and appreciate your time, and welcome any feedback you may have either through this webcast or via email.
Thank you.